Welcome to Who Begot You. This is a conversation about the Whigham, Andersons, and Hannahs and how we're all connected and related through DNA and as far back into slavery. So, the photo that you see there was a photo I created many years ago. It was a collage of my grandmother and all of her siblings that had children. Um, And so I just wanted to be able, everything that I do is really to honor her and our ancestors. And that is the passion that I have and why I do what I do. So let's get started. As I said, my grandmother is my motivation. So this year alone, I was able to find this photo that you see on your left, I believe it's on your left, of a woman. Her name is Lucretia Earl. And she was living in Orangeburg, South Carolina. And what was stated was that was her husband. And someone had this photo in their tree. And I was blown away. So with every presentation, I always share this because we're doing this because we want to find connections. We would love to be able to find these kinds of photos. And when I saw her, how the mannerism of my grandmother, how she held her head. So I love showing this picture to my family because they know some thought it was my grandma, some thought it was her mother. This is actually about her third great grandmother. So the next slide I always have in all of my presentations, DNA don't lie, it verifies. And that's the very first thing we have to accept. Good, bad, challenging, and different. We're doing this because we're using DNA to find answers. And some of those answers we were not looking for the first time, the second time, the third time. And that has been my experience this year alone. But we have to let the DNA order our steps. So, next, the focus of tonight, order our steps. So, next, the focus of tonight, order our steps. So, next, the focus of tonight, order our steps. So, next, the focus of tonight, order our steps. So, next, the focus of tonight, order our steps. So, next, the focus of tonight's conversation or the focus of our research, right? Before we start jumping into looking at slave records and looking for ancestors, we're going to start with our oral history. We're going to build a tree. We're looking at census, marriage and death records, cemetery records, probate wills, newspaper, military, freedmen records. And, there's many other sources of records. And then we're going to start looking into DNA. And many times we're going to do this interchangeably. But then the question is, how do you accept all of those matches that you have, those thousands of matches, and you don't have a clue how you're related to them? So, about me. So I was literally born. I'm in Rochester, New York. I was born born here, and I am still here. My family migrated from Macon County, Alabama, to Rochester, New York, in 1964. But my grandmother was born in Bullitt County, Alabama. And then after watching Roots in 1972, like many of you, I vowed to find all of her ancestors. I wanted to know the people who were related to her and her ancestors, who begot us. I started this journey about 35 plus years ago. And Emily and I kind of stumbled on each other somewhere within the first 5 years of that. Somewhere in about 5 years, I taught myself computers using the internet. I mean, using genealogy. We literally have been researching that long. And it's taking technology over the years has improved that is furthering our advance. It pains me a little bit that it's taken 30 years before I was ever actually able to get it further with the research. But DNA has really helped me to go so much further. My third great grandfather, through my grandmother, was born in Maryland in 1819. And in the 1870 census, this is what he said. And it was like, how did you get to Alabama? And so we're learning many roads lead to Maryland, South Carolina, North Carolina, Virginia, but how? How did this happen? So my goal, as I've shared, is to find my ancestors that have been separated due to slavery. So why do I consider myself this genealogy devil's advocate? So that's on my everything now. And that's because my daughter said to me, I was trying to figure out what's my purpose? Why am I doing what I do? I'm going against what the scientists say. I know that. But that's because when I did a chat GBT on that, it was saying to me, the devil's advocate around genealogy is a critical analyst, someone who scrutinizes and critically evaluates genealogical claims. And that's what I know that I'm doing. That's what many of us are doing, right? So this is not just about I'm the only one out here trying to do this, but I really am scrutinizing what you're trying to tell me and how you're trying to tell me to go about this research and your justifications for why. Skeptical researcher, a person who questions and accepts genealogical conclusions and seeks to uncover potential errors or biases. And the contrarian genealogist, someone who deliberately takes an opposing viewpoint to test the robustness of genealogical theories. I was like, if that was not me, I don't know what to tell you. One thing you will learn about how I approach things, I'm definitely going against the traditions and how they want us to go about it. One of the primary ways I do this, I take my chromosome search down to 1. And the reason I do that is, you'll start to see later, but if you're not related to me, it doesn't matter how low I go. It will say there's no match. And so I want to ensure that you are not related to me at all. So I'm going to test in GEDmatch, which is pretty much the only place that I found you could do that in. And primarily GEDmatch's projects. So that's one reason why I love that of having a project. It allows us to see these relationships lower than the 8 centimorgans that many of the DNA testing authorities share. We're able to take them lower. But you don't want to do that until you build a foundation. That I will say. So this first half of this presentation tonight, and this probably will be shorter compared to the other information, is really about the foundation, laying the foundation for doing the slavery research. So even though they said African American genealogical research can be challenging, it is not impossible. The difference, however, is when we have so many relationship entanglements that occurred in our family lines, unlike many other nationalities. And so that's what slavery, we've come to find that's what slavery is. When researching our ancestors, we have to keep an open mind, let the DNA guide us, and use non-traditional and conventional methods to determine our relationships with each other. So tonight you're going to hear and you're going to find that how we're connected is through, these are some of the locations, right? In Alabama, these are some of the Alabama, and there are a few more that I just thinking, like Lee County should have been on here, Montgomery, Birmingham, those are some areas, but that's when we get post 1870. So that's one reason why I probably left them off, because our slave ancestors primarily were in these areas that I'm showing you here. Georgia, Jefferson, Georgia, Burke County, Georgia. Never knew about those places. Never knew about those places until I started connecting with other cousins, and then they were telling me where their families were from. North Carolina, South Carolina, and it's like, how am I connected to South Carolina? Never would have thought or imagined, but again, we have to let the DNA connections be our leading point that helps us to figure out how are we connected in that way. Emily, her and I have been researching a long time. For the longest, she would go to a lot of genealogical forums. I was looking at records. So pre-COVID, she was going through a great deal of forums that they will host Family Search, hosting so many different projects. I was like, no, I don't want to come to those. I'm going to look at the records. I would say to her, the answers we're looking for are in records. But one thing that stands out to me is someone said to her, if you're in Alabama, you have to get out of Alabama and start looking at like Louisiana. And I would say to her, how are we supposed to do that? We could have Louisiana connections, but we don't have a clue of what takes us there. And it makes it challenging to be able to do that. And I believe and I know because I started looking at the records. That's how come I could accept getting out of Alabama and venturing into some of these other locations. Surnames tonight you will begin to hear are here on this page. So it's not just Whigham, Anderson, and Hannah. It is also Walden or Wiggs, Haddon, Arrington, Denny, Bostick, Beatty, Carswell, Fleming, Gay, Lester. Those were tied because of the individuals who married together. But Lacey, McKigney, Poland, Brown, there's probably a few others. But these are those surnames that the Anderson, Hannah, and Whigham line actually we descend from. And if you have DNA matches to any of these names, this is most likely where a great deal of those leads are coming from. Step one, starting with the oral accounts of your family. We're going to ask everybody. So when I started with my grandmother, her father's name was Henry James Anderson. He was 30 years older than her mother. He bought 7 marriage licenses, but only married 6 times. He had 23 kids, but after I started researching over the years, it was about 26. He was not from Bullitt County, Alabama. He was from Barber County, Alabama. And she even mentioned Marengo. I didn't know what any of those meant. I just had to go with what she said, right? Her mother's name was Emma Marlilla, Lucina Lucana, Luvana, Elizabeth Sasha Lee, Francis Cope. How could one person have this name? So all of these are things that really was driving me to prove her oral accounts. She was born in Inverness, Alabama, and that is in Bullitt County. My grandmother had her first child at 13, and which was my oldest aunt, and she was living in Inverness at the time, still Bullitt County. She later moved to Fort Davis, Alabama, which is in Macon County, where the rest of her children were born. And by speaking with her and gathering all of her sibling names, we were related just from the basis of this research alone to Andersons, McGrady's, Copes, Masons, and Birds. So, of course, got to start figuring out how am I related to these names. So this is what my ancestry profile looks like after I tried to sort out all of those children and all of those marriages. It literally scrolls and scrolls and scrolls. So I was able to find the records for all of the marriages, all of the wives and their children. And on the right side, where's the brown ABCD, those are the outside women that he had children. So I think this one reason why, knowing my family line by itself, the red line that goes to the red box and it says my grandmother, this is her mother's children. The man was 30 years older than his wife. So I already have a strong basis of how I can't go by normal traditional conventions of research, because this math doesn't math in the context of how you figure, how you may believe, or how researchers may believe the bulk of our parents were within 5 years of each other or so, right? 10 years of each other or so. And then you have all the outside women. So there was no, at the time, based on up until today, there was no endogamy. They knew who they were. They knew who their people were. And, they were close to slavery. So they knew how they were related at that time. But this is what my research looked like after I gathered all of the information she shared. Okay. The next step, absolutely, is connecting them to the 1870 census. And we know many people who are beginning their research more recent have a challenge with a great deal of that. But this is what my tree looks like in me connecting this to 1870, connecting this to at least all of the ancestors that I can find. So, of course, the top part is my paternal line. The lower part is my maternal line. And so I was as far as I could go, right? So when I said to Emily around pre-COVID, I need to go look at records because I need to find these people's parents. This was my stumbling block. I was done. I was done doing all the due diligence I could do. Okay. So now we're going to look at our highest matches through DNA, of course. So now, of course, we're going to the DNA. We want to see what the DNA is saying. So through the Anderson surnames, you're wondering if your family is actually taking tests. So I have so many more family members than what I'm showing here. But in conversing with these people and finally having conversations, Sylvan is a second to the left, a second or third cousin to me under the Anderson side. Cheryl White, her tree was a little broken, but she had a name in her tree, which was Lucretia. Someone was named Creasy in her family line. And I said, there's no way you aren't related to me. And then, we have the DNA. And finally, we spoke, I believe it was earlier this year or last year. It took 4 years for her to answer her message to me from me on Ancestry. But she finally did answer. And then Maddie Christian, I knew who she was. Her and I have spoken over the years. So I know my DNA is starting to line up, so let me add you guys to my tree. So you're my height or matches on my maternal line and my grandmother's father's line, that is, that I knew I could build a foundation on. That's DNA and Ancestry. So now, one day pre-COVID, I got a call from a cousin. She's in the album cover you see there. Her name is Denise. And she contacted me and she was saying that she was looking for information online about Lucretia and James Whigham. And I was like, who are they? I knew Lucretia and Henry Anderson was my line. Who is James? And what's this Whigham name? Her and I chatted, and she was able to help me to understand that they were in Barber County in 1870. And James Whigham was the enslaver. So she knew that her line descended from the enslaver and Lucretia and the Whigham name. I knew my line descended from Lucretia and Henry. I did not look at, in 1870 Barber County, I found an 1870 census record for Anderson. I wouldn't take a notion to look at for another one. I found what I needed, but they were actually recorded twice. And so now, pre-COVID, I need to jump ship. So what you see there was, after I spoke with her, this was about 2018. After I spoke with her, I now needed to research these Whighams. Who are these people? So she shared with me a record that was recorded in the Alabama Archives, Department of Archives, where our family line actually was involved with trying to get reparations for slaves. And a few of the family members recorded that James Whigham was their enslaver. And so based on that, I started looking in Ancestry. Now I'm needing to look for the name Whigham, different things like that. Now, when I look for the name Whigham, the very first name I saw was this one here, Sherry Whigham. And, and continually to research, I'm looking at a Taurus Smith. And of course, we got to look at their tree. We got to make it make sense. We got to go look for census records. And then one day this year, actually, I finally tested in my heritage. And this young man, Jonah Israel Ridgway, he showed up when I searched for the name Whigham. And when I looked at his tree showed me a sibling to my Lucretia. And it was just amazing, right? But now, DNA is telling us these are the connections. How do you make it make sense? So luckily I had the cousin who contacted me, something of substance I could go by. But of course, now my question is, who are their siblings and who is their mother, So on 23andMe, this was a 23andMe match. I didn't do 23andMe until this year. But this is someone who is related to me. Oh, she has sub-Saharan African. So she has a high descent of African, and I searched for Whigham for her as well. So, of course, we're looking at all these platforms, trying to find relatives and trying to make it make sense. Let me see your tree. 23andMe is telling me we're related through the third great grandparent. Who is that? How do I find them? And then I did a search in Ancestry for Whighams in Alabama, because now all of a sudden I'm starting to see Choctaw show up. So these were some people that were related to me through GEDmatch. These were more of GEDmatch relations, or I have access to others' DNA. So when I did a search in Ancestry using their DNA, I was able to see that I was related to people under Whigham in Choctaw. And then, of course, some of them migrated to Mississippi. And it's difficult trying to accept many DNA matches because you're trying to connect the dots. So now that I know that I've done the 1870 as much as I can, you must know the land boundaries and how they change from one period to the next. And then you build the family tree for the enslaver. And you find on the 1870 census and all pre-1870 census records for the enslaver. Because again, the information we're looking for is going to be tied to the enslaver. So you'd have to know their family, right? And then after you know their family, then you look for the probate, marriage, and deed records for the enslaver. So this is, if some of you are not aware, but this is basically me showing you what the boundary lines of Alabama looked like, especially when we're talking about pre-1870. So this is today what Alabama looks like. In the box, you have Macon, Mac is Macon, Bull is Bullock, Bar is Barber, PIK is Pike, Montgomery is MTY, Elmore is EL, Lee County is in the upper corner of this box, Autauga is absolutely a county that I realize we have ancestors in. Butler is the bottom left corner. I think that's Crenshaw and Lowndes. I haven't seen a great deal of matches in those other two, but in all the other counties, yes, absolutely. And then 1870, boundary lines still looking pretty solid. So Alabama didn't change by too much after emancipation. But then you're going to start seeing some gray shades. Pike is taking on a great deal of Bullitt County because Bullitt County was not created until emancipation. So that was one reason why I had to go look at other counties, because in order to understand what it looked like in 1870 when the enslavers were there, I'm no longer looking for Bullock. Half of Bullock is Macon County, the southern portion. A corner of it is Montgomery County. And then parts of it is Barber County. And so you must know where your enslaver is living, where the slaves are living, where the records are. So this is one reason why I felt I had to go looking at records. Then as you continue to go further down, you're starting to pay attention to how these boundary lines have significantly changed. 1830, we're looking at the Trail of Tears, when now the Native Americans have sold off the land. There were deeds where they sold the land. They went into an agreement and they sold the land. Montgomery I'm just paying attention to that tonight. Montgomery is this entire area. And so that means if Montgomery was in existence in 1830, that's where you're going to be looking for records. You're not looking no longer in Macon. Macon wasn't in existence. Pike County still has a significant portion that leads into Barber. So this is really where you have to know where these boundary lines are changing for the time period of your research. And now this is when the Creeks controlled Macon, Bullock, Montgomery. 1820, Montgomery was in existence, but all of the shaded areas were under Creek control. And then 1810, this is totally what it looked like. So as you're starting to look at slavery records and enslaver records, you must know what the boundary lines look like at that time. I don't even know how to look for Mississippi Territory information. I probably need to see what information lies there. Is there an online repository? This is just reminding me of that is one source I do need to take a look at. is there, because we know the enslavers migrated there by 1819, 1813. You know, they migrated there to check out the native area and before the Trail of Tears occurred. And so they were living there. We know for a fact, Emily and I's late 1700s. The surname Fitzpatrick, Stinson, they were in Bullitt County, Pike County area. So if there's any records to be found, where are they pertaining to those enslavers? So this is Alabama. And this is just a conversation about, you got to know the lines. And so now that I'm opening it up, my search to Whighams all over the place, you know, and now I started saying this year, are you on GenMatch? What's your ID? Let me just take a stab to see, am I DNA related to you at all? So what I'll tell you, the people you see, when I go to GenMatch, that's because Ancestry did not show me your name as a match. So I had to go to GenMatch and I had to take it lower than 8 centimorgans just to see if I'm related to you. So this is shot in the dark. And so I take it down to 6 and I'll take it down to 4. You know, in the beginning when I started doing this, I didn't know what I was doing and where was I heading. So I would take it to 6. That's just under Ancestry's number 7 and 6. Am I related to you? So I got a little bolder as time persisted. I was like, I'm going to take this to 1 and see what it do. Because I just want to see, is there a match, right? And that's where you see Jerome. He's on the phone. He's on here tonight. Kathy Marshall, Candace, she's on here. And so now all of a sudden I'm starting to see more people. And then when I triangulated the right corner, the third column, when I started looking at other people's matches to other people with the surname Whigham, then I'm starting to see how people are related to Whigham that are related to me either through Ancestry or GenMatch. Okay, how are you related? So this is just showing you how when we're trying to take shots in the dark of how people are related to us, I'm now looking at lower than 8 centimorgans, especially column 2 and 3. How do I make it make sense? That's the question of tonight, of course. So you must research the enslaver, hands down. If you are looking at trying to find pre-1870 records, stop and build trees of the enslaver. Because I will show you tonight why you must do this if you're going to make sense out of all those surnames I talked about earlier. Connect your matches and the 1870 census family members to the enslaved ancestors, and then you'll find in your research, you'll begin to start seeing how things are making sense. Now, this is Georgia. So once we start going into the enslaver, and I started building trees for the Whighams, I started with the Whighams, and now all of a sudden they're in Jefferson County, Georgia. I'm like, okay, I didn't know about this place, but let me see what's going on with Jefferson. Let me see the land boundary lines. So this was Jefferson in 1870. You're starting to see some shading, not much. Jefferson and Burke, keep those two locations in mind, Jefferson and Burke. Further back we're going, you're going to start seeing Jefferson Burke was solid, 1819. Solid, 1809. Solid, 1798. Solid, 1796. And this particular website I found is telling you what counties are carved out of what other counties. Now all of a sudden, Jefferson is gone. 1793, there's no more Jefferson. It was only Burke County. So I must know that, depending on the age of our enslaved family members and the age of the enslaver, when they were born, when they were in the location that they were in, where are the records? Where am I going to find these records? So Burke County was 1793 and 1790. This is what it looked like. So I think Burke actually shifted. So it's a part of Washington, Burke, and I forgot what OEF is. Maybe it's Albert. But at the end of the day, this is where I know I need to look when I'm looking for those additional records. So tonight, the Hannahs, the Whighams, the Arringtons. There will be many more. Will be what we will see in the presentation I'm going to show for you. So this was just part one. This is showing you my matches in Ancestry and my maternal side. And the green basically is telling you that I have linked them in my tree. So what I do, if I know I'm DNA to you, regardless of where that match is, I'm going to see your tree and I'm going to add you to my tree until we connect. So I'm going to start with the oldest ancestor and I'm going to connect you. So I've connected, I thought this was 50, a great deal of my maternal matches. And up until where your tree just looks terrible and I can't match anymore, right? But I connect you. I don't just see the match. I want to know that you are in my tree. It's because the algorithms and the scientific calculations that Ancestry does, I don't know what they're doing. I don't look at all of their hints. I only look at the hints that make sense to me. But I want to make sure that you're in my tree, especially so that if there are some algorithms and connections going on, they're there. So I just wanted to be able to show what my tree looks like. I mean, the fact in Ancestry, I've connected you to my tree. So this is the slide. These are the slides where I'm using portrait instead of landscape. And so it may not be as visual clear for you. And I'm going to pray that I'm going to share some overviews so that you will understand. This is more about the substance than it is about the visuals. Now this is when I need to look at the enslavers' records so that I can see what slaves' names are coming out. Okay, if you watch my documentary, I believe predominantly a lot of the people who are on here tonight have seen my documentary. One of the things I shared in the documentary, and at the time I created that documentary in 2019, I did not connect the dots yet. I knew it was there. I didn't connect the dots. So the connecting of the dots was, I mentioned that Lucretia, who is my family line and many of our family line, she was a slave of the Whighams. But what happened was, what was mentioned in a record was that she was sold to the last name of Walden. I couldn't make that make sense because she ended up with the Whighams in Barber County, Alabama, right? So I mentioned it, but I glossed over it, but I knew I needed to go back and research it. So what happened was, and you'll see in the slides, that the Whigham, a Whigham enslaver married a Hannah. His wife was a Hannah. And I could tell that her husband received Lucretia and other slaves from the Hannah line. So I needed to research now the Hannahs. What is the relationship of the Hannahs to the Whighams, other than the fact that Mr. Whigham received slaves from his father-in-law family? So the Hannahs originated out of England. So many of us have ties to England. I'm beginning to understand that they were some of the first settlers here during the colonial period. So that's why a lot of us have percentages with connections to England. Thomas Hannah was the only Hannah that initially came to America around 1756. And he settled in Georgia. So again, you got to know what the boundary lines were, right? And what counties were there or what was the location at the time. 4 of his children had or was eventually given slaves when he died. Based on DNA research, it appears he may have been the father to Sook. And I'll share with you toward the end of the slide where I'm getting that DNA connection, that he may have been her father. So that's one of the European connections that I have. There was no census for Georgia in 1830, around the time, I believe this was when he died. So there are no census records for Thomas Hannah. Because, again, Georgia wasn't created for census until probably close to 1830 or 1840. But when he died, there probably was no census. So we have to look at other records. But anyone deceased before that time period, there's no census. Okay. So these are the slides that look a little confusing. I will try to zoom in on many of them to help you to see where I'm going with this. But Thomas Hanna, this was the tree I created in Ancestry. On the right in that red box is his children. All of the children who received slaves when he died. On the left is he died in 1818. His son, William Hanna, he was living 1775 to 1829. There's no census on William. His daughter, Elizabeth Mary, married a Haddon. She died 1830. His daughter, Ellendor, she married a McKigney. She died 1845. He had a daughter named Nancy. Her last name was Allen. And then there's Sook. Now, I will zoom in just a little, but I'm going to share with you how the distribution of the slaves went. So that's why this isn't so bolded and so large. But when he died, he literally said, I bequeath Sook and her family as follows. And I was like, wait a minute. The descendants of Sook was a family. Okay, let me break this down. So what you're looking at when it comes to the naming configurations that I use, I want to say nomenclature, it didn't come out. But I start with a letter. That's my oldest ancestor to date. I give their next generation of children numbers. I give the next generation of children letters. I give the next generation of children numbers. Just like your haplog group. I didn't know about haplog group 35 years ago when my granddaddy had 26 kids and I needed to try to number them and come up with my own way to track them. This is the number, this is the structure that I created for myself. So anytime you look at anything pertaining to me, these numbers allow me to be able to track backwards to figure out what child are you connected to? How are you related to me? So Sook and her children, Sook was valued at 300. Her son Charles or Charlie was a man valued at 700. Betty was valued at 225. All of Betty's children were not listed at the time because we'll talk about that later. But this was me tracking. Now I need to track these children and these slaves. Easter, Sawney, Beck. So we see slave names, right? But we got to track them. And I needed to track them. And I needed to understand, where did these slaves go? And what does it mean in correlation to, could these people possibly be related to me? So I'm going to talk about next how the distribution of the slaves and how the connection to you guys came to be. So we're going to now look at William, his oldest son, William. And William, of course, is taking the name Hannah. So William, he took Sook and 5 of her children. And it says they were loaned to William Hannah. So Charlie, little Kate, and her child Abraham. Beck, Sonny, and her child Easter. They were to remain with William until his youngest child came up to the age of 21. So we're talking about 1818. So if William's youngest child was born 1812, we know that's another 9 years or so that those slaves were to remain with the estate with William until his children came of age. And so what this meant is that I could track Sook and this set of children, and they may have had the name Hannah. But then Thomas Hanna, William's son, died in when Thomas Hanna died, then William's son, who was named after the father, Thomas Hanna, was given a slave named Tom. And then the slaves, I'm sorry, that's probably small, and I'll try to increase the view of that. But then the slaves, Jim, Hannah, Dan, and Pris, were to be sold privately. I do not know where they went, unless, I connect with a cousin and then I could see these names in a tree, that kind of thing. But then old Bob and Nancy were to remain in Georgia on the place. So now we have a Bob and a Nancy remaining in Georgia. Jim, Hannah, and Dan and Pris were to be sold. Trying to find the record for that. But then William's son was, which is Thomas' grandson, was given a slave named Tom. So right now, at least this core set of slaves have taken the name Hannah. Sook had a daughter named Easter. Remember that name, Easter or Esther? As I looked at people's trees, what this is showing you people who actually have in their trees a name that I could connect back to Easter in Hannah's line. Ancestry matches, matches. So they shared their Jed match with me, or they had their Jed match in their profile. And when I did a search, and then I could look in their tree. So, and actually, this is to show you that there was a slave, Marquita Berry. She had the name Allen in her tree. Based on the slave research of Esther and Esther had a son named Willis who was born at that time. So Willis actually took the name Allen. Easter or Esther was given to Thomas Hannah's daughter, who married an Allen. And because I have DNA connections to Marquita, because she had Willis Allen in her tree, I was able to connect Marquita's line to Willis, which was a descendant of Sook. So one, that's where these names Allen may be coming from. Tom Hannah was given to a daughter who took the name Walden. But many times those families still, when they got free, took the name, they may have taken the name Hannah, or they may have taken the name Walden. So these DNA connections here are actually connected to me through the surname of Walden. This person here, Pamela Jackson, how do I make sense of this? It took me a day or two, because she has a West Walden in her tree. Remember, I said Lucretia was given to a Walden. And I was like, to see this was amazing. But now I need to connect her West Walden, who has no grandparents, no parents added, to my tree. So I literally had to go to the 1900 census. And so now I'm trying to find Wes. But Wes is born in that time period where 1870, he wasn't born. 1880, he wasn't born. And we know there are no records for 1890. So I had to go so far as 1900 to try to backtrack Wes' family and figure out who was the family. But in 1900, there was someone in the 1900 census for this area who was listed with the name Walton, not Walden. And because Pamela is DNA to me, and we know that many times they change their names. Sometimes they want to just be distinguished, they want to stand out, they want to be different. But Wes Walden, I strongly believe that this is the child or the descendant of Sook, connecting to this family that I found in 1900. So this is where the surname Walden may come from in your tree. Again, because they're bequeathing these slaves to family, and especially these girls, especially the daughters and sisters. So now we're going to look at Elendor McKigney. Because she was given slaves, I use these icons that Black Pro Gen has created to try to visually give me a visual understanding of the person that I'm looking at in my tree. So Thomas Hannah's daughter, Elendor, she married a guy named James McKigney. There was no census in 1830. Elendor's husband was James McKigney. So there is no, and he died in 1829. So there was no census for me to track. Did he have slaves that he brought into his marriage with his wife? But I know that his wife had slaves. In 1830, Elendor was recorded on the slaves. The slaves that she received were actually recorded under her son. And 3 of her sons are recorded as having slaves. So the tracking of Elendor McKigney, she received the slave Sambo, who was a man, and the children of Elendor and James from Thomas's will, the children were given Easter, a woman, and her children, Beck and Sawney. Now again, I'm looking for, okay, did they happen to make it to the 1870 census? Is there any McKigneys? But with that, Thomas McKigney, this is the son, on the 1830 census, he had the 4 slaves or so that his mom had. Then 1840, he now has 7 slaves. Did someone have children? Okay. But then he died in 1845. And we know that he was given a slave by his grandfather. So now when he died, and I found his probate record, he died with the slaves Richard, Mara, John, and Barry. Richard could have taken the name Dick. That's something I have to flush through. But I have not found any McKigneys. So in 1870 that were Black in Georgia. So, that is going to need some further research. So Elendor's son, James McKigney Jr., he died in 53. And so tracking the census allows us to be able to see the growth of the slaves, the age of the slaves. I tell people, and maybe I need to find a new way to phrase this. I do love Alabama in researching slaves, because they did not have any 50, 70. There were no true plantations. They had families. It makes it a lot easier for us to track the slaves that they have. So James McKigney, Elendor's son, he was tracked with having some slaves all the way through the 1850 census. And then when he died in 53, these were the names of those slaves. Sarah and her 2 children, Siler and William, George, Caroline, Henry, Reuben, Allen, Essex, Julian, and Francis. So did they take Hannah? Most likely, because they were bequeathed from, but were there purchases, right? So we don't want to assume, did Mr. McKigney bring slaves in, and so they got together and then they had these children? There weren't that many men and women. So we got Sarah had 2 children, and then there's a man and a woman, and the rest are children, kids. Henry, Reuben, Allen, these are boys and girls. They're families. And so if I happen to see someone having these names in their tree, and their DNA related to me, then I can say, that's who you were. That's the name that you took. I can adopt you in my tree with this understanding of how slaves were given and bequeathed and separated. Anything in red, I believe, what you're going to see when you see things in red, I believe I found a connection that I may share later. Then Elendor had a son named Beatty. 1840, he had no census, no slaves. 1850, he had 1. He's not recorded as having 5 slaves, but by 1840, he had 5, and then he had none. So even though he had 1 by 1860, he relocated to Troop, Georgia, and is not recorded as having slaves after that. Where did the slave that he had go? So this is a conversation to help you to understand. They kept them in their families, especially depending on this time period. Georgia and Alabama, because of the with the Trail of Tears and with the removal of Native Americans, these lands were native to them, and so they started with a small subset of slaves, and many of those slaves were just families. So when we're looking at the distribution of the McKigneys, this is what it looks like. And again, I have not seen any McKigney as surnames. And I have not connected some of them to the family as far as through DNA. And some of them I have, but we'll see later. So now Elizabeth Haddon, which is Thomas's daughter, we'll take a look at her slaves. So Elizabeth married a Haddon. Thomas Haddon was given Lipio from Elizabeth's father in 1818. So Thomas Hannah gave Elizabeth, his daughter's husband, a slave named Lipio. We do know sometimes that cursive could look, the penmanship, this could have been an S, this could have been an L. Until we can see it in someone's tree, that kind of thing, we got to go with what we got, but we record them. So Thomas was given a slave from the Hannahs, and Elizabeth herself, she received Big Kate and Big Kate's children, all of these people. So these were the slaves that were given in 1818 to the Haddons in 1818. When Elizabeth's husband died in 1830, it was stated that after 5 years, the slaves Abram and Esther were to be sold or distributed to his children. So Abram and Esther were recorded there. Where are they up here? Actually, they're not up here. They're not recorded up here. So those are 2 additional names that I would have needed to add to track. And then Elizabeth Haddon, when she died in 1830, there were no slaves recorded, so they must have been sold. So this aligns with the known African-American family members who are recorded in Barber, Alabama, and I'll share with you where those names are coming into play later. Okay. So now so Mary Haddon, these were the slaves that she were given. Mary Whigham was given a woman named Darkis. Her daughter Aseneth, when her husband died, was given Phyllis and her child, Sarah and Barry. Nathan, their son, was given Bob. Margaret Fleming was given Sarah. Elizabeth Clark was given Grady, a woman and her 2 children, Lisette and Margaret. And then Jane, who married a Denny, was given Charity. This is showing you now Scipio or Scipio. Hannah Walden Wiggs. And I recorded this way because this was how Scipio was distributed over the years, depending on when someone died. So the face you see here, her name is Kayshawn Wade. I did a search for Wiggs, or I think I did a search for Scipio, Hannah and Walden. I did a search for that. And when I did a search for that, she showed up as a cousin. And when I looked at her tree, I saw the name Scipio Wiggs. So Sook had a son named Scipio. Earlier, I thought it was Lipio, who was initially given to Thomas Haddon. He was the son, so he was a grandson of Elizabeth Mary Haddon, who married William James Haddon Jr. Scipio was given to them in 1818. So the theory is that over time, Scipio was sold, and based on this person's age, this was probably the son of Scipio. And for however reason, he took the name Wiggs. So I would need to research this Wiggs connection to our family. But through DNA in that name Scipio, we would need to research further to be able to understand where did the name Wiggs come into play. But again, many slaves got sold. Where's the record tracking for that? Are there any deeds? That's where we could take this further. But this is showing you how to link the DNA to the enslavement and the distribution of slaves. So now we'll take a look at Nancy Allen, that name Allen. So Nancy married a man. So Thomas Hannah, daughter was Nancy. Nancy was given the slave Silva. No other information was found on the Allen line. I did not find a lot of other slaves with the name Allen other than what I shared earlier about the name, that one connection that I had to the name Allen. So this was a conversation about the Hannahs and how Sook and her entire family were distributed across Mr. Hannah's children. But now you have to pay attention to, again, when they marry, what's going on with the connection of those lines when they marry. And this is when we start looking at Sook line, all of her line, through all of her children that I've been able to find connections with. And so far, these are the ones that I've been able to at least identify by tracking and being able to see if they had slaves or not. I mean, if they had children. So we're going to take a look at them here. So Sook's descendants, these are all of the locations where Sook's descendants and those people, her children that I was able to find descendants. Betty, who took the name Whigham, and she was in Georgia, Alabama, then Mississippi. Esther or Easter remained in Georgia. She took the name Hannah. Tom took the name Walden. He remained in Georgia. Little and Big Kate were Whighams, and they went to Georgia, then Alabama. Scipio took the name Walden. He remained in Georgia. Allen took the name Whigham, and Parker Whigham was in Georgia and then went to Alabama. And we'll take a look at the DNA connections through those names. So Easter, I shared with these earlier. These are the family members that when I searched for DNA and I saw them and I saw their tree, I was able to link them to the slaves that had been identified. And remember, Marquita was the only Allen that I was able to find to date. So now in looking at the Whighams, now we'll look at Thomas R. Whigham in his line and how we took the name Whigham. So in analyzing his line, Thomas R. Whigham was born in Scotland, 1726, and he died in Louisville, Jefferson, Georgia. So it appears he was in this area before the Hannahs even arrived. He had 3 sons who lived here in Jefferson, Georgia: John Byron Whigham, who died in 1823, William Porter Whigham, who died in 1851, and Robert Alexander Whigham, who died in 1824. Robert's line is my direct line of slaves that the Whighams took. But his sons, John Whigham, here died early in 1823. Sorry about that. Thomas Galloway Whigham left Georgia with his brother and went to Alabama. Joseph Whigham Sr., Thomas and Joseph settled in Barber County, Alabama. And it was Joseph's wife, who was Elizabeth Jane Hannah Whigham, who Thomas was her father. William Hannah died in 1829, and it appears Joseph Sr. and his brother Thomas eventually purchased or hired the slaves from the Hannah over time. And then they took those slaves to Alabama, and these are the slaves where Sook's descendants and others have married into her family line. So now this is about taking a look at the Alabama to Mississippi connection. Because the Georgia connection, I'll share with you later when I'm going to talk about census records and how many slaves people had and what names remained in the area. But now we're solidly related to these Jefferson, Georgia, and now we're moving into Alabama. So from the will of John Whigham, who was in Georgia in 1823, there was a Mary Whigham and Robert, Bob, and Jack. From the will of Andrew McNeely, Andrew's wife was actually Agnes Nancy McNeely, a Whigham. And I track the names of the spouses because they may be bringing slaves in, right? And then they marry into the family. And so that's where that next branch occurs. So the wife's father gave her John and Agnes Whigham, and 9 additional Negroes were identified in his will. So so he gave the couple 9 Negroes that were not identified. So I don't know who they were. I'd have to track this name McNeely further. But are there DNA matches to this name? And so this is about connecting the dots to the matches. Then we have to do the record research to connect that portion. So John Byron Whigham, when he died in 23, these were his slaves: Jack, Sal, Isaac, Shane, and Sarah. They went to his wife, and Jack and Bob went to his daughter, Mary Robert, who married a Donaldson. I have seen the name Donaldson in my tree. I have not heavily tracked that. But is Donaldson another possibility that needs to be tracked, right? John Byron Whigham, on his probate record, again, this is now where he's allocating the slaves to the family. But now Isaac, who went to Nancy's Whigham wife, and then all of a sudden there's this name Beatty. James Beatty purchased at $415 for $415. Jack was hired out in 24 before there was a sale. Sal, I saw this name Gordon, and I was like, who is this man Gordon? Where's the name Gordon coming from? What daughter married a Gordon? So that I can understand who Alex is in correlation to the family. Am I related to any Gordons? Do I need to look up that name, right? And then here is the Donaldsons. Here is Jane Denny. And then Chloe, an old woman, was given to Alexander Gordon, possibly Agnes McNeely Whigham's father. But again, what was that her maiden name? I have to track that name. But then I use this to go into these testing platforms to see, am I related to these names? Are they in these areas? And then with a lot more certainty, I can have conversations with the DNA connections. So the slaves were allocated to the family, but the purchase was by other people. Jack, a man, as you see here, was sold to Jane Whigham Denny, who was a sister. Shaney and Child Henry went to John Whigham. Isaac went to James Beatty. Sal, I've mentioned the Gordon surname. And so here is where I'm showing now, based on those women and who they married, can I actually find a connection to someone with that last name? So I was able to find a connection through the name Beatty, who settled in Butler County. No, that's Kentucky. But it's about trying to connect the dots. Now, again, when they marry, right, was this line connecting to our line, but this line reared from Virginia, and then eventually they went to Kentucky? So many times this is why we don't find these connections, because we don't know the movement, or we have to pay attention to the movement. But that's where the Beatty name could be a possibility that you may have seen. And then here is Agnes McNeely. Elijah Maynard, who is a DNA connection to me, he has a McNeely connection in his tree. So to some extent, this is how we can connect the dots with that name McNeely. So now we're going to look at census, right? Because now this is about tracking when they died, how many slaves they had at the time. And what I want to be able to show here is just that in 1830 in Georgia, the Whighams existed with a few slaves. Joseph, Thomas, and William. These were all brothers. They did have some slaves. But then when William Ephraim died, who was a child of the Whighams, I believe he purchased this slave from his uncle. So here is Sarah. I think we've seen this name Sarah before under William Porter. And now we're tracking how many slaves did they have. Then when they died in 37, what was the names of these slaves? So if I were to look in Decatur, Georgia, would I see any Whighams? Would I see any Whighams that are DNA connections? And because William Ephraim Whigham's children were young, the slaves were to remain. in probate, or they could have been hired out. So that would be a line out of Decatur, Georgia connection that I would need to investigate further. Now, 1840 census and through 1850, and then here's more brothers, John and Whigham, John and William. They have slaves as well. And John has a lot, and they're in Jefferson, same area as the Hannahs. I'm sorry, the top portion is the Hannahs, and then the bottom is in 1840 where the Whighams. So they're all in Georgia, they're all in Jefferson, and this is how many slaves they had and who were recorded with slaves. Okay. So now this is William Porter, and this is about showing William Porter's slaves. And tracking, I'm trying to track how many slaves he had in 1830 and 1840, just so I can see the growth. And then when he died, a great thing we can do is we can link the slaves to the census. Now we can track who's connected to what census year. But William Porter, when he died in 1851 in Georgia, this was me tracking the slaves, as I shared, to the actual census, based on the allocation and based on their ages and what slaves he had at that time. But these were how his slaves were allocated across his children. In 1848, we've seen the name Aseneth. So Aseneth's brother, he actually managed her slave. The father created him, allocated him as a trustee. And again, she had Phyllis and her child, Sarah and Barry. And so Nathan had Bob, Fleming last name, Margaret had Sarah, Clark, Lisette and Mary, Jane Denny, we saw her, old Bob and Nancy. But now this is how those slaves were allocated here. But it's not known who purchased them. Some were to remain with the wife, and then some were sold. So this is how we lose sight on some of our family. And then right after 1840, the Whigham men left Georgia and went to Alabama. And because they had land grants, that's where we see that separation move. But this is now showing William Porter's daughter, who was named Sarah Anderson Porter, which definitely means there were two marriages. She married someone named Clark. Here's a third. They migrated to Barber County. And then when I searched for the name Poland, there's my cousin Ray, right there. When I searched for the name Poland, I was astounded. I was like, my goodness, I actually have some slaves in Barber. I mean, some family out of Barber. Because other than the Anderson and Whighams, I knew of no other connections. And I couldn't connect even the people who were Whighams because I needed to understand how. You know, we don't accept names just because they're names. We want to see the proof. So Ray is connected to me through the Poland surname. Jim may be another name for Bob or James, but this is where I believe my connection to Ray is. Aseneth had Phyllis and her child Sarah and Barry, and Tomaine Harris has the name Arrington in her tree. And I believe that Aseneth Arrington married a Arrington, and I believe this is where this connection is coming from, through this Aseneth Arrington who married a Arrington. But these slaves were allocated again from the Hannah and the Whigham surnames. Now, slaves who were given to William Whigham's daughter, Elizabeth Whigham Clark, who married John Clark, migrated to Barber. So this is showing how I'm trying to align the DNA connections to the story. So first we'll take a look at my brother Don, because even in Ancestry, I don't have any connections to some people where my brother will. So it's great to be able to have access to more than one person. And so my brother actually was related to this gentleman, Mr. James Robert Beeman. And this is out of Barber County, Alabama. He was born in Barber, died in South Carolina, but he's a match to us. And so under the name Clark. So this would hint to me, under the name Clark, did someone have sex with a relative that's a close relative that would make us related. This is something that has to be investigated. Under a Nicole Medina, she has 6 centimorgans. The gentleman, James Robert Beeman, he's 9 centimorgans to my brother. And then the second match is Robert Neal Beeman, same surname. But I was able, in looking at his ethnicity breakdown, he's 1% Cameroon. And the rest is European. England, Ireland, and Scotland. So basically, this is showing how he has a hint of African American in him. So how far back does this go? But it's about make sense of our matches, right? So the next match is this name Bostic. Arrington, Whigham, and Bostic. So William Porter's daughter married Samuel Denny. Their daughter Martha Denny married a Bostic. Over the years, the slavery passed down within the family. So it's possible that the Bostic slaves married into the Whigham slave, and this is our connection. And what I'm showing here in this screenshot here is how the Whigham went from Whigham to Denny to marrying Bostic. And it's as early as Martha was born in 1816. The daughter Eliza was born 1847. We're still talking about enslavement period. So very, very much so when these slaves got handed down and they became the Bostics, did they get so separated, they took this name when they became free. And I never would have thought of the name Bostic until my cousin David Anthony Taylor said, you need to look at the Bostics. And I was like, what? Did a search for Bostic. So in Ancestry, me and this cousin Erica M. Card, she's 18 centimorgans to me. David is Jedmatch connected to me. But then as I analyzed his tree and I was trying to get an understanding of his Bostic surname, even though they migrated to Arkansas, they were in Georgia. In 1832, his Thomas Bostic was born in Georgia. And he has not been able to add any ancestors to Thomas's surname. So this is about bridging that connection between David and myself under this name Bostic, understanding and realizing that a Whigham who was a Denny married a Bostic. And those slaves were passed down within the family. Now in Jedmatch, he may have only been 3.8 centimorgans to me. But that means we are 6. But Jedmatch says our closest common ancestor is 6 generations. What you're looking at right here is 6 generations. But we got to remember it's a give and it's a take. It may be less, it may be more. The other thing I won't get into tonight, but I will highlight, I'll share later. We may be related through more than one ancestor. And these systems don't tell us that. They only give us the first. But when we're related through more than one ancestor, we can't associate this common ancestor to everyone. So this relationship just very well could be further back and not 5.95. I'm related to him through more than one ancestor. I know that for a fact. This may be a different relative of mine where we're 6 generations. But these are things to note and things to remember. Okay. So now we're going to look at the 1850 census, basically. Who was alive, who died, who are we tracking? And now in 1850, the Hannahs were still in Jefferson. There were some others. I don't know if they were relatives, like Alexander up there. But the Hannahs in 1850 are still in Jefferson. We've already looked at all of these Hannahs. So we understand who they were and what slaves they had. But now in 1850, the Whighams are here in Jefferson, Georgia. Some of them were in Jefferson, Georgia, remained behind. And they did have slaves. But then the others who went to Alabama, this is what we see. Thomas, John, Joseph, and Joseph. The Joseph and Joseph is Joseph Sr. and Joseph Jr. The Joseph Sr. and Jr. are my lines. as far as relative connections, right? But I'm related to you guys through the other ones as well. Okay. So now we'll take a look at who? Mary Jane Carey Whigham. So this is basically the wife of William Porter Whigham. Her maiden name was Carey. And all this is highlighting is what I've always shared. We should always take a look to see if we have any matches to the spouse who married into that family. Did they bring slaves with them? Were they allocated slaves from their family? So this is one reason why you must create trees for the enslavers. Because this is how come we're missing understanding our relationships to these names. I did a search for the name Carey just to see what it would do. And there was my cousin, 58th, Thasia Charles Carter Carey Sr., born in Virginia, died in Virginia. But this basically alludes that those slaves were separated, may have gotten purchased. And what this is doing, right, what I'll tell you as family, I'm trying to tie my Hannah line to Virginia and Maryland because of some activity that was going on over there. He was born 1861 in Virginia, so I need to go a little further back, the 1830s, to see who is that person. But this was about tracking that Carey surname. Do I have any matches to Carey? Then I would look and see how many my brother has. My brother tends to have a lot more matches than I do because men do tend to get more DNA and have more DNA connections than we do. So it's amazing to be able to have men test and being able to use their connections to see if you could get more than as women our own. But now this is the surname Carey you want to think about. Asenath, this is about Asenath had the slave Darkest. So we remember she was given early when she married the slave Darkest. Darkest was a slave of her father, who was willed to her by his wife, Mary Jane Carey Whigham. And now she's a slave of the daughter. So this has gone through probably the grandfather, the father, the mother, and then now to the daughter. This one slave, how she's been passed down to different family members. This is Asenath's husband, Abner Van Winkle Arrington, when he had in I think this was in 1840s, he had this many slaves. And what's highlighted on the right, this is a son who actually, he died in, I think it was Montgomery, Alabama. I know that Bobby Arrington's and Lang were in Montgomery. And so this is about tracking that connection to this name, Arrington, out of Georgia and trying to connect the dots to that surname. But Darkest, what my theory is that, so this is what I'm saying here is, remember, William Porter died in 51. Phyllis, the slave, and her children went to Asenath, which was Phyllis, Sarah, Berry, and now Darkest, is given to her by her mother. Because the slaves were now under Arrington, they may have taken that name. In 1860, Abner Van Winkle only had one slave. This kind of alludes to me that maybe those slaves went with the sons who may have migrated away because maybe he had gotten older. He only needed one person to care for him. Oh, I'm sorry, Bobby, it was Birmingham. But my theory may be that Darkest may be Bobby's ancestor. And this is how he's related to me. This is how he's related to us. From the Whighams through the Hannahs. So now this is a conversation about John G. Whigham in Jefferson. His wife was a Caroline Matilda Carswell Whigham Poland. I track every name I can find because I'm trying to track the surname path, right? The family lines, the descendant tree line. So in 1850, John Whigham, he had all of these slaves. When he died in 1854, these were the slaves that he had. Wilson, Andy, Jane and her child, Bob and Alec, Lindy and a child, Laura and Liza, Amos, Mahala, Margaret, Jenny, Nellie, No, Henry, and Daniel. But then I wanted to see, am I related to any Carswells? Elijah had Carswell in his tree as well. So this is just about vetting these last names. I never would have thought of this name. Didn't understand how I was related to him whatsoever. I've seen his name. As I'm searching, I look at his tree, nothing stood out. But now it starts to stand out and it starts to make sense. So Carswell is a surname we got to consider to add in our arsenal of searches to try to understand how we're related to that surname. Okay. Thomas Galloway, these were his slaves. I talked about him. And this is where the allocation of his slaves went. In 1859, he died. And these slaves went to, these were all of his slaves. But now we start seeing the name Smith. In Alabama, especially Bullitt County, Macon County, I've seen the name Smith. I could not understand how to relate to the name Smith. But now that I see in 1859, he died in Pike County under this name Smith, will any of these, oh my gosh, Francis is a name that I've seen. I've seen Francis under the name Cope. I've seen Francis probably under the name Smith. Absolutely didn't know what to do with it. But now I know that I can research the Smith surname because maybe in Pike she took that name. Because now they've been separated from Georgia. Have no way, no clue of being able to go back to Georgia. They're not in neighboring locations and areas. And so they may have felt like, okay, I'll just take the name Smith when I became free. But then we have some here who continued to take the name Whigham, may have taken the name Whigham because they were given to Whighams. And another thing, they could have taken the name Whigham as well. But this is the possibility that I could take a look at because now I need to figure out where was Mr. Smith living. Maybe he was living away from the subset of family when he purchased the slaves and took them. And then down here were some names, Adam Grubler and a Reynolds. Never would have thought of those names. But again, these are those possibilities we have to consider when we're trying to figure out how we're related to people. Okay. And then Big Kate. Big Kate is in Georgia and Mississippi. And Big Kate, these were the slaves that were associated with Big Kate. And then these are my DNA matches that I have in all of the different systems, how I believe you guys are related to me. I've seen Stephanie Williams Whigham. I think I met with her through a research group. And I got her, probably got her name, got her jet match, and was like, oh, there you are. The Ruthie Rhodes person, what I'll tell you about Ruthie, I do have Rhodes as a surname. I was trying to fit her in the Rhodes surname so bad it was crazy. I just kept trying to push her to Rhodes. Girl, I know I'm kin to you. You are Rhodes. Until I looked at her tree. So she's connected to me under Big Kate. And then Cherry and Jerome are connected to me through those different connectional lines in their tree. And then this is showing a Smith that I'm related to out of Pike with the name President Smith. This is 1905. That means he don't know how to go further back. And that means I need to try to figure out where is this Smith line connected to 1870 so I could connect those dots. But now that I know where I'm looking for, and now I can see if there's at least any DNA matches, I now have a starting place. And again, if you just got on not too long ago, the point of this conversation I'm having with you about these enslavers, if you are researching and you have stumbling blocks and you're now trying to find slaves, build the trees of the enslavers. That is a must. Stop looking for cousins. build the trees of the enslavers. Because what I'm now showing to you is how I'm able to make sense of that person's last name where it doesn't stand out to me whatsoever. I never would have looked at a Haygood. Doesn't make any sense to me, but when I look in his tree, it does. And this is under the Sook's son, Alan. So these are Alan Whigham's DNA matches to me. And you'll see Emily's name down there because when she searched for, I forgot what we were searching for, Emily, Hannah, Whigham, one of those, she was able to see a Crystal Johnson. And then when I have access to Emily's DNA, I looked at Crystal's tree. I could see where it connected most likely to a Whigham, which was Alan. Also, David suggested I look at Bostic's. And when I looked at Bostic's, I saw this person here, a Janice Bragg. I reached out to her. She's in David's tree. David has this surname Gate in his tree. I'm trying to make this make sense. So now through the Jet Match, I'm related to David. I'm related to Janice. How? And then when I looked at the name Gay and I looked at the Whigham through her tree alone, I was able to understand this surname connects to us through slavery. And I'll show you where the Gay and Lester, I shared earlier that Gay and Lester, so a Lester married a Gay, and that's probably how they connected, but this is how I'm able to see the connection between that surname. 1860, now we're getting closer to emancipation, but in 1860, in Georgia, these are the Whighams that are in Georgia with slaves. These are the Whighams that are in Alabama. Now we see Barber, we see Pike, and now we see Washington County, Alabama. And now, and basically what you're tracking is when you see that enslaved tree, you're now seeing sons went to Washington and sons went over here. And it's like, okay, I see you. But you took some slaves. So now we got to figure out who the slaves were that were taken. And the beauty about this, now we could go to 1870 and see if any of these names are starting to connect. Okay. So 1870 and beyond. I've just shown you Sook's children and the possibility of how we're connected to all of these identifiable surnames and going beyond 1870. So these are the children of Sook, and not all of them, but these are her main children. And then, of course, we are descendants under that line, right? But Elizabeth was born in Virginia in 1825. I'm like, I see you, Virginia. I'm coming. I'm coming eventually. But she died in Pike. And she married a prior. So now this is, are we related to priors? I did a search for priors. Yep, related to priors. And if you're looking at priors in Alabama, possibly, I believe, maybe Mississippi because of Betty, and we'll see that later, then that's why you're looking at those surnames. The next one is Parker. I mentioned Parker earlier. What was amazing to me with the Parker surname, my cousin that I found in my heritage, the only person I saw two, but the Parker I found, the young man in my heritage, he had Parker Whigham in his tree. And when I look at the birth of Parker, he said 1820 in Georgia, but I was DNA to him. And that'll at least let me see that Parker, or who Parker married, is my relative under Sook. And that's how he and I are related. So I started to be able to see Sook's children. Alan Whigham died in Jefferson, Georgia. The way the story is, and you'll see it later when I share that, married an unknown Native American based on the story, and named their daughter Sookie. Sookie was an Allen who married a Lassiter or a Lester. And then her daughter married a Gay. So that's that connection to those names that we may see in Georgia. Littleton. Littleton is one of Sook's children, born in Georgia, married Kate, and these are the children. Wright, Priscilla, Gabe. I think Wright is the connection to Jerome, if I'm not mistaken. But I do have DNA connections to many of these people in the tree. What I will highlight is you start seeing some of these little icons I'm using, right? So when you look at their names, we don't have pictures. But this says I'm using an icon that says confirmed relative. I used to put the text DNA after it. But now what I'm doing, I'm using the images to at least let me know out of all of these children, I have identified DNA under these names. And I drill down under each one looking for that icon or looking for a picture. And this is telling me this is who you're going to find the DNA match under. So this is what I use to track my relationships to people. Is I add you to my tree, but then I got to figure out who's your line, who's your direct line. And I do that with these images. The next one is Betty. Betty had a daughter, Lucretia. And Lucretia is the one that I spoke about in my documentary. And so her siblings were Bill, Alan, and then Dick or Richard. And I think I had mentioned a Richard earlier, and I may have mentioned a Dick. Names are interchangeable, and they went to Choctaw, Alabama. And the story with these Whighams here, you'll see Joseph Whigham is above the red border Lucretia, Joseph Whigham. So his goal was right around the Civil War, he decided he wanted to migrate to Mississippi. So he left Berber, heading to Mississippi. I think he had a stopover in Washington. I think his son was in Washington. Then he made it to, I believe he made it to Choctaw. But he died before he was able to make it to Mississippi. Some of his children made it to Mississippi, but he died before he was able to make it there. Joseph Whigham Sr., that is. Actually, he died in 1881. So the next one under Sook is Lucretia, my line. And I see Dorothy and her mom. They're here with me in Rochester. But this is our ancestor here, Lucretia, and all of her children. And the numbers basically are indicating that she had a set of children by Joseph Whigham Jr., I believe it's Jr., it could be Senior. I don't care which one of it is. Daddy, son, I'm tied to you either way. You know, it's about getting their DNA or their gen match and proving the connection. Probably you'll never get that. But in the meantime, I know that we're connected to Joseph Whigham. But then she also had Joseph Whigham is the enslaver. That's not our line. My line is under James Anderson. And then 2 represents all of the children that Lucretia had in Barber County. Well, some were born in Marengo, and then they ended up in Barber County. How did they get to Marengo? I don't know. That's another story I need to try to figure out. They hit Marengo, then came to Barber County, and after 1870, they were in Bullitt County, in Greenwood, the Greenwood community. So, okay, enough about me and us. This is about all of us. And then Dick or Richard made it to Mississippi. So you got some Whigham, some Hannah, some all these other names over there in Mississippi. That's where this connection is coming from, most likely under Dick and Richard. And one thing we got to remember, right? When they became free, they either tried to make it back to the family or they were making it forward to the family because some family was taken away. So that migration started to occur. They wanted to connect back to family. And so it's about trying to understand those relationships, right? Okay, so that's the Mississippi. This is Barber County. Allen died in Barber County, and he married a Matilda Johnson Whigham. Now, where this Johnson name stands out, I'm connected to Emily, who's on the call, under a name Johnson, and she's connected to a Whigham. And so it's about bridging the gap. So her and I have connected ourselves to at least 2 ancestors out of Bullitt County, Stinson and Whigham. But now we've been able to see where that connection lies. I think we're still trying to vet if this Johnson, Emily knows the story, is a parent to the Johnson that married a Stinson. I mean, they're tied, you know, they're bobbing and weaving, right? And they're connecting. And that's where we're having these multiple relationships with cousins to one line. But you got to know the story. You got to break down these trees. And again, if you're trying to find slaves, please build slavers' trees. Any name that you think you related to, slow down, go look, because they love documenting themselves. Go build a tree. Create you a tree to that family. I think I see Kayshana, and she missed the conversation, but she gonna see it. So, Bill Whigham. Bill died in Jefferson, Georgia. He married a farmer. Are we related to farmers? That's a question, people. But, and I was able to connect Bill to the child, which was named Wesley. So, yes, there were Whighams that remained behind in Jefferson. There were Whighams that went to Barber, Alabama, Bullitt County, Alabama, Choctaw, Washington, so many different places. Oh my God, there's a lot of stuff in the chat. So now I want you to be able to see who's connected to me under Betty. These are not all of my connections, but these are definitely the people, some of the people I reached out to that are related, connected to me either through GEDmatch, through Ancestry here. So this was strictly through the name Whigham. This is Parker Whigham's connection, and this is Jonah, the young man that I mentioned to you where he was on My Heritage. And then Josiah Ridgway is a Parker descendant, Parker Whigham descendant. This is a match on 23andMe. I just joined 23andMe this year. Search for the name Hannah. And as I looked at her profile, I might reach out to her. She's born in 1987. She may be willing. But as I looked at her DNA breakdown, she has Anderson in her tree. And she has Hannah in her tree. She's a fourth cousin. That's going to put her at about Betty, or I don't think it'll put her to Sook. So grandparent, which is my grandma, her father, Lucretia, Betty. It connects her at Betty, somewhere in there to that. That's where Betty lives. But when I looked at her DNA breakdown, strictly European. She ain't got a hint, sliver, or nothing else. So this is where I know we're connected through Whigham's and definitely through Hannah's, through the European connection. I have 7%, but she's 100% European. So this is how we triangulate our matches to garner an understanding. And basically this means she's 100% matched to me. Thank you, Lord. She's matching me at about Betty. That means Betty's father was a Hannah. I think I already added that to the tree. So I know that I'm DNA connected through the Hannahs. Because someone had sex with Sook, had a couple of children who were probably mulatto. And although all of the records may not say that, we may see that in 1870 or the slave census when they say M for mulatto, right? But this is how we're going to tie that information and how we use all of these testing platforms to do that. Here is some more. Joan Kuberos. We're related on her father's side, I guess, but McNeely and then John Byron Whigham is standing out here. So Joan had McNeely's in her tree and Whigham's. And I want you guys to understand, I'm connected to many of these names under 3 centimorgans, at 3 centimorgans or less. But the records shows the connection. So how low can you go? I'm just saying. Bobby is related to this young lady, Latasha Wilson, and then Latasha is related to an Arrington out of Alabama. So this is how we're going to triangulate these names to make them make sense. And then this is Elizabeth Whigham on her maternal side, on her paternal side. But this is really just showing you how I'm making it make sense. Out of Choctaw, Alabama, I think you saw Sherry earlier and Parker, but they migrated. Some of their family migrated to Choctaw. And these are those connections that I have in those areas and locations. So, Native American, all I'm going to say about this is it's complex. we saw that they migrated. They were supposed to have migrated away, but not all of them did. My grandmother said her grandfather was half Indian. In Bullitt County, they were Creek Indians. Then her sister, my grandmother's sister, said that I think she said we were Choctaw or something. Where'd you get that from? But again, depending on what story they got, depending on the connection they got. But while I was researching, what I wanted to show you, which was amazing to me, this is the connection to the Gay and Lester line to be received in the Choctaw Nation, but they were denied. But in that process, and basically it would have been through the female, in that process, this is where she talked about so many questions and so many that where were you born? Where was your mom born? Where did she die? What was her father's name? Was he black? Was he white? They just grilled her. And that's page 1. That's page 2. That's page 3. And then this is where the decision came in, why they decided what they decided. And what's sad is they decided it because she wasn't certain, but it was how they were able to trick her. But what we got to remember, right? If her mother was born in 1819, her mother was born in Choctaw Nation in Georgia. Strong possibility of that. So she didn't know what it was at that time when her mama was born. So she could only speak to what she was told and what she knew. So this is just about taking up the charge to see, could she have qualified, knowing what we know now with the records that we know now. But these, I'm telling you, it goes on and on and on. It was amazing to be able to read, to see the records. But this is how you find the father. So earlier I said that her father was an unknown Native American. That's because I pulled it from this record. So this is the first time I've ever seen a family member trying to apply and being able to see on the Dawes Commission rolls their record, their information that they recorded. But it's not my direct line, but it's a family line. But again, could that line be connected to me, depending on what side of the tree that they're on, right? And then this was just a census where she was potentially, Ancestry was trying to suggest there's a Sookie in here somewhere in this line. And was Sookie in the Choctaw Nation in 1883, that kind of thing. But these are those records that are out there. I don't know what to search for. Now, I do have Lucina, Luvana, Elizabeth, Sasha Lee. I keep searching for the name Sasha Lee everywhere because I'm trying to see, was she of Native American descent? Where is this name coming from that my grandmother's mother was named after? Okay. So what I'm showing you here is just a visual of how you're not going to see it clearly, but this is in a spreadsheet that I'm building, how I'm going to track the name of the slave, who they were first sold to, who was they second sold to, who were they third sold to. Where were they living? Because in order to track these relationships and who was given to who and where, we got to be able to document it and put it somewhere and get it out of our head. So this is just showing you how I'm tracking Sook's family. But again, for those of you who just joined, when Thomas Hanna died, he said, I bequeath Sook and her family. That was it. All of these people are descendants of Sook, which is why we are related under these names and these surnames. Anyone in red, I've been able to track to a DNA cousin of some sort or connection. So, impartially in closing, remember, your DNA matches are not just paternal, maternal. They may look like this on one line. Multiple connections on one line because we have all these different grandparents, right? Because of slavery, we could be connected to people more than one way. And people are trying so hard to fit their ancestor in one box. Put that square in that peg, circle hole. No. We have to let the DNA speak for us and to us. So in closing, DNA don't lie, it verifies. So let it guide your research. So what I wanted to be able to show you in true closing is my what it looks like, my DNA matches. And I'm going to go to through lines, and I'll talk briefly for less than 9 minutes about through lines. So, and I'm going to look at Sook directly. Sook is, and actually, I'm going to look at my brother, because for some reason, Sook I have 29 matches under my brother and only 24 under myself. So that's why it's so great to be able to test more than one person. Especially men, especially males. Get them tested, y'all. Get them tested. All right, Sook is there she go. So here I have 29 matches under Sook. So this way, if I forgot your name, and now let me talk to you about through lines. Do not use through lines to build your tree. Do not do that. And the reason you don't want to do that, what has been shared with me in other groups that I belong to, through lines, Ancestry is not putting any financial support as far as development to through lines. Through lines is a hit and a miss. So I have added all of you in my tree. And when I expand the matches so there's still 24 matches here. So these are the people. So Sherry, you saw Sherry earlier when I was speaking about my Anderson match to Sherry White. But Sherry has been added to my tree. I don't know what all this is. So actually, remember I said to you her name was Creasy Ann Townsend? It was Townsend. So when I saw that I had a match to a Creasy Ann Townsend, I didn't understand Townsend at the time, but I knew that name Creasy. So I knew she had to be named after an ancestor. And this is out of Bullitt County, Alabama. So here we see Cheryl and Cheryl's children. Then under here, there is Amani and Mary Keys. I know I've added the Keys surname. Kaylar Dublin is new to me, but she's coming under Abram. I use through lines to just show me matches. And what is your line under this match? So I'm related to Borders, and then this person is under Borders. So then I'm going to either look and see if they have a tree. I right click, I open in a whole new tree, a new window. And I think this says Erica Bates. So that might be that child's mother. Okay. So that basically this is showing, which is true, Anthony Cooper, which is my Anderson line. But now I'm trying to discern, okay, am I related to you? What would be interesting if it shows up on DNA matching. No, Ancestry would probably say no. What I said. They're here in Rochester. Now I'm supposed to know who that is if they're here in Rochester. And I got my people on the line. But as you can see, they're not showing as a match to me. She might not have taken a test. That is true. But I know she's related because I know that connection. I didn't know Dallas has some kids here in Rochester. Wait a minute. That's different for me. When I let y'all talk, we got to talk about that, cousins. I didn't know there were border relationships here in Rochester. But nonetheless, I'm really trying to show you not Henry, not Creasy, but Betty. I want you to be able to see the matches that I have under Littleton and Betty, Betty's brother, under Sook, and just how we are all, related in this regard. I think I've done Joshua already. I do not want to do Henry. I don't want to do Henry because I know Henry. Where did Littleton go? Hold the phone. See how it flaked on me? It didn't show me Littleton. There she goes. So this is Stephanie. But it's showing her most likely because I've added her to my tree because I didn't see all these names before. I did see Ruthie, and again, I kept trying to force her to be a Rhodes, when in fact she's under Priscilla after I looked at her tree. So I use through lines just to try to get an understanding of a new match. But now that I understand my Whigham lines a lot better, I can speak to that with strength and strongly. Prayerfully, you guys will after tonight. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing. And there was a lot of questions in the chat. Bobby, all I'm going to say, I got to address Bobby. Bobby, You missed everything I said talking about you and the Arringtons. That's all I'm going to say. So I was sharing how I believe your Arrington came into play from the Whighams, and your ancestor is probably Darkest, because Darkest was a slave from the Hannahs, passed down to a granddaughter who married an Arrington. But then when the mother died, the husband only had one slave when they should have had about 4 or 5. And then their son, which I shared with you in the past, migrated to Alabama. So I believe that could be your connection to Arrington, which is through Darkest, who was a Hannah, and how you and I are related. Okay. There
Yeah,
will be.
I know that my great great grandfather came out of Nash County, North Carolina, from that Archibald Arrington plantation over there. I think they had 350 slaves on there. So
Oh,
then that was him, Ben Arrington, then Oliver Arrington, then my mother, and then that's me.
okay. So we would have to definitely look at that. But the Whigham line married into the Arringtons. And again, this is the conversation where I said you got to track the enslaver spouse. Because if that spouse came from that North Carolina or their ancestor, well, then that's where that's making sense, right? And
Right,
then that Arrington could have connected with our Hannahs, and that's how you and I connect through
right,
that Arrington connection. And again, another thing I shared was that Arrington could have brought slaves into the marriage,
right.
and did they connect? So it's about trying to make sure that we can understand these relationships. You got to build the trees of the enslaver. Okay, wait a minute. You had your hand up, then it left. Come on back. Go ahead and share. Because I forgot that, Bobby, but I forgot who had her hand up.
It was me, Nikki.
Yes,
I
Miss
just
Nikio.
I just wanted to say, I don't have a lot of research in the areas where you guys are at. I'm mainly in Sumter County, Georgia, as far as right over here, but I know that bleeds into that. But this was a really impressive presentation, and I like the way you showed how not to use the through lines to build your tree, but basically just to call your matches. Like I do all my research with my matches first. And if I keep seeing a common ancestor, I may add them to the tree, not for them to be my ancestor, but just to see how many matches come down through there. So I like that.
Right, definitely. And once I started adding all of you based on my research to the tree, boop, 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 I never saw this many Wiggums and Hannahs in my life. Kayshawn, you gotta speak. That's my young blood. I saw her and I was like, oh my goodness. I believe I'm connected to you through Scipio, Miss Kayshawn.
Well, my name's Keyshawn.
Kayshawn, thank you.
Yeah, and it's really first, it's really interesting because I'm in upstate New York as well for school. I'm over in Ithaca,
Huh?
and I literally have to drive through Rochester. So that's really interesting to have that connection. But something that I was interested in is because Scipio by name, like, is somebody that like I've heard in stories from like my grandma and my great aunt. And so like I have that oral account of him, and like adding him like to the like building my family tree in that way, adding him to the tree was easy, but I wasn't able to like add any more context to him. So I'm really grateful that I was able to like get some of that context here because I the name Sook never came up. And there is kind of this mystery a little bit of like his origins, you know, um, his daughter's origins, because I'm through his daughter Elizabeth.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, this was really, really insightful and really helpful. And I'm really, really excited to like go a little bit deeper and make more connections.
One thing I mislooked at, but I caught when I did the presentation with you guys was Scipio. Your Scipio was born 1830, I believe. And the Scipio that I had was older. So basically, what that means is my Sook's son Scipio basically would have been the father to yours. And if nothing else, or the relative, right? They named them after Scipio. And many times that's the nomenclature we take in our family. We're gonna name family, especially when we get separated, after relatives, because we revere them. That's what they did. They revered their ancestors and their relatives. So awesome. But I was so happy. Oh, it took me And then I think you had Scipio Wiggs, or I think it was Wiggs, or I'm like, where did this name come from? Oh my goodness.
And that was something I had a question for as well, because I'm wondering, because of like literacy and like the idea of like phonetic spelling, is it that Wiggs is like an informal abbreviated version of Wiggum,
We
or
do. Oh, that is cool. That's an awesome, cool thought. There were some digs, I think, but you're right. It could be, because I've seen the name Fitzpatrick narrowed down to Fitz. Why did you name yourself that? They could have been running from something, right? Could have got in trouble, switched up the name. So that's a very cool observation. I think that makes me feel comfortable about accepting that name and where that came from. Okay, another question.
Oh, I had missed the whole spiel about Lucretia Earl, the our Jamaican ancestor. Did you find out how they like got over here? Like
That
from
that
Jamaica to England to South Carolina, like how that even came about?
Well, what I will tell you, that I mentioned earlier was, so the England piece. So I'm just coming. I hated, and I hated history. Let me put that out there right now.
Mhm.
I was like, I
History
couldn't
was my
stand.
favorite class.
I just did it enough to pass a test. Why are we studying any of this stuff? I hated history, and that's all I do every day, all day. But I do not know the strength of history with the Revolutionary War and all these foreign wars, right? But these records and these locations are forcing me to learn. What I've now realized in this year is that the Europeans came over from England to save the souls of the slaves. I mean, to save the souls of the Indians, to give them some Christian learning, to share Catholicism with them. And so they came over into the Maryland, the Virginia, and they were establishing those 13, what are they? Because I'm tired. Colonies.
Yeah.
They were helping to establish those colonies, right? So then they were bringing in the slaves and having sex with the slaves. So that's where we're getting our connection early on. It's not in the 1800s where we're finding these connections to the European connections. It's further back in slavery. Another thing we got to remember, in one of my lines, I've seen an enslaver, not this line, but one of my other lines. I got to remember it is our line. And this, I think this is a Lloyd line. Y'all don't connect the Lloyds. This is a Lloyd line. Well, your mama said, yeah, we do.
Yeah.
And somewhere in Alabama, we're gonna
Yeah, I'm Rachel this door. Yeah.
You're right, yes, we do. But the Lloyd connects to this guy, this Reverend Anderson Brodus. He had like 20 some kids with about 13 slaves. Then they had kids. Then the son went and had kids with the siblings because they were just property. So they were purposely, they didn't want to buy slaves. So they was just having slaves, birthing slaves. And so it's because of this convolutedness of these entanglements that were occurring back then, why, to me, they don't want us to go to one, Senator Morgan. But we have to. I first got to know, am I related to you? After I figure out I'm related to you, let me look and see what your tree, does it make sense? And if it don't, build the tree of the enslaver and then see where those connections are coming from.
Yeah.
So that's where that's coming from. But as far as the England and the South Carolina, one thing I will tell you that I've seen, many of them, when they came over in the 1600s, some of them went to South Carolina, North Carolina. And then from South Carolina, they immediately went down to Bullitt County and Pike County area. And then eventually, so I've seen some newspaper articles that were saying, I'm looking for my brother. And they're in Alabama, but they're looking for South Carolina connections. And so they brought their slaves when they traveled to other locations and areas. And so these are just some of the things we have to keep in mind. But before you get there, build your tree to 1870. Make sure you find your family member on the 1870 census, because that's going to tell you what name they took. Build a tree of that enslaver. Now, no, it may not have taken those names, but in Alabama, they tended to do that. BioTea.com. Our concentrate teas are special blends with a variety of herbs and spices that you just add to water. Once you mix and stir, you can enjoy them hot or cold. Find out how we made water better. BioT.com, drink your way to better health.